Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 29th WIDER Annual Lecture. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you here in Helsinki and also our global audience joining us via UN TV. This year's lecture addresses one of the most urgent questions in development. How can we ensure social protection for all? Today, over 2.5 billion people in the global south are reached by social protection programs. But too many still fall through the cracks, not because they're overlooked, but because systems are overburdened, fragmented, or difficult to access. Our lecturer today, Professor Abhijit Banerjee, brings a unique perspective to this challenge. A co-founder of the Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab, JPAL, and a pioneer of experimental economics approaches to development, his work has helped governments around the world understand what works and why. He's a Ford Foundation International Professor of Economics at MIT, a fellow of multiple academies, and a co-recipient of the 2019 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. His research has helped transform development economics, and as the Nobel Committee noted, has significantly improved our ability to fight global poverty. Abhijit will speak for 45 minutes, followed by remarks from our discussant, Dr. Marta Chen, chairperson of the UNU-WIDER Advisory Board. We'll then open the floor to all of you for your questions in a moderated Q&A. So please join me in welcoming Professor Abhijit Banerjee to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I believe this is the 40th birthday of WIDER, so happy birthday. You're young. As Kunal said, I want to talk about effective social protection. I want to make essentially three points. First, why social protection is, I think, by any reasonable standard, in what way can we say that it's undersupplied? Second, what are the standard arguments for why one should not necessarily extend social protection, and why I don't believe them, to be honest. And finally, what can we do to make it better? So those are three parts. And I don't think there's anything I have to say that's particularly dramatically different from anything that's been said, but I think it's worth organizing maybe those ideas in a way that's sort of makes them hang together. So first fact, which is I think very well known, but still worth emphasizing, is that poor countries redistribute less, and not just it's not just that they have less money. They redistribute less as a fraction of total public spending. So that's what this is saying, is that if you put on the horizontal axis GDP per capita, and on the vertical axis total transfers received by the bottom 50% as a share of total public spending, that number is high in a country like France, and low in a country like DR Congo. You can see India is just below that line, and Pakistan is just above that line. China is just below that line again. So this is a choice, because it's an allocation of public resources. Now the choice is constrained by the total amount of available funds, and maybe you have to spend a certain amount on defense, so what's left is less. So I think that another way to look at it is the extent of social insurance, so much even more narrowly defined, money and the definition of social insurance is itself dodgy at best, because as you might imagine, some programs are directly replacing loss of employment, and other programs are dealing with are more self-selected programs where anybody who wants a job can have one. So, and all of those are, taken as different variants of social insurance. But again, you may find that graphic hard to read. Even I find it hard to read. If you squinted, you would see that at the right end, where you see countries like Cambodia, Burkina Faso, Bolivia, Chad, Liberia, and on the left you see mostly middle-income countries like Ukraine, Montenegro, Jordan, and in the middle you see a bunch of the richer countries as well. So again, the poorest countries have the least social insurance, and that's one more step, because it's not saying even part of the public spending that is available for various social activities, the form taken by insurance is more limited. Now, that's also worth saying that these are choices, that even very poor countries vary substantially in the amount of social insurance, social assistance. This is social assistance now. So South Africa is the dark blue bar that's very tall, and Congo is the dark red bar to the left, the fifth one from the left, and that's very small. And that's a pattern. The middle-income countries have more than the low-income countries. So the lowest-income countries tend to be, in all of these respects, these are, I'd say, I'll show you all this because it's worth emphasizing the different scalings. Nothing's perfect, but you worry that maybe they just don't have any money left over after paying the teachers or something. So you can take a set of very poor countries, and within those countries which have fairly comparable levels of per capita GDP and public spending, you still see large variation. Now, of course, rich countries also have variation. The US is at the bottom, and Finland is at the top. So those are no surprises there. But so that's all to say that social spending is a choice. It's not just a matter of it's not a mechanical function of per capita GDP. It's not somehow that if we have money, we spend it. We clearly, I think that's the one thing to emphasize. And then, having said that, you worry whether that's a reasonable way to be. And I think a lot of social spending, especially in continental Europe, is money that goes from the middle classes to the middle classes. Not necessarily, people say that to say that it must be a waste, but it isn't, because it still changes the targeting substantially. And I think I think it's too easy to say that it's just round tripping. But I think that what is very, very clear is that a lot of continental European countries are not doing their social spending to reduce extreme poverty, because there's very little extreme poverty. Poorer countries are at least as unequal as middle income and rich countries. And part of the reason why we don't know the answer to that question is that the poorer the country, the less good the data on the rich. So in India, the NSS basically misses that all the rich people, then there is a lot of, depending on what you want to do with the NSS data, you can create numbers that will then make you feel very good or not, but you're missing 50% of GDP in them, so then you can decide what to do with the rest of the GDP. If you give it to the poor, they look very rich. Nobody knows actually where inequality measurement is extremely poor in poor countries, so we really don't have this sentence that poor countries are no less unequal is based on the poor data we have. But then extreme poverty, I think there's no dispute, is in poor countries. And these are also the countries that are increasingly, perhaps not increasingly, perhaps always been, but even more will be subject to a lot of shocks out of their control. The climate shocks in particular are already there, and all of that means that there's a huge need for some kind of support spending, which is a problem. Now, of course, just to put the obvious out of the way, poor countries have less resources. So that's unfortunately a given. Partly that's a result of the well-known fact that there's more informality, so it's just harder to tax. That's part of also the reason why we don't have good data on inequality, because one can ascribe incomes to the poor without measuring it, potentially. And then I think there's also true that the tax collection systems are much less effective. In particular, now there's some interesting work showing that the urban taxation of urban property is really disastrous in most poor countries. I've seen numbers like 10% of the devaluation that would be reasonable is being collected. Problem is valuation issues are big, and in general, in addition to the informality, there is really a problem of enforcement. So I think both of these are important. As a result, the taxation is much more indirect than direct, and this graphic is showing that if you look in Africa, indirect taxes is a much bigger share of total tax revenue than in Africa and in Asia, than in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, or even in the Anglosphere. So indirect taxes, big, as you can, this is what I was alluding to before, property and wealth taxes, almost non-existent, and then you are left with the indirect taxes. So that's all of that. Those are important issues that I think need to be tackled if we want to make progress with social spending. I'm going to say no more about that. It's not my expertise, and it's a vast area, and so I'm going to stick to mostly to the spending side after this. But it is important to note that there is a lot of work to be done on the fiscal side. So, as I said, the second part of what I wanted to talk about is sort of why. And I think there are many arguments for why maybe it should be that we just spend less in poor countries, even relative to the tax collection. And one of them is this argument that very old argument, at least going back to Kuznets, but I'm sure if I were more of an expert, I would be able to name some wise 19th century person who already said that, which is that, you should first grow and then redistribute. And I've seen Kuznets, of course, famously made this argument that this is even automatic, that is, you grow first, then somehow some magic happens. And he based that on the experience of, I think, really 8 countries, but maybe 13, depending on exactly how generous you want to be to him. And there was some self-selection there as well, so probably not the best data. What's the evidence on this? So I think if you look at the cross-country correlation between countries that redistribute more and countries that are growing faster or are richer, the cross-country correlation is robustly negative. Countries that are richer or grow faster redistribute more rather than less. That was known. About 20 years ago, there was an attempt at revisionism. I think most well-known work on that is by Kirsten Forbes. It's my colleague at MIT and one-time student. She showed that with I think data that had just become available around year 2000, that reductions in growth, reductions in inequality in her data predicted reductions in growth. So growth, you reduce inequality at the cost of reducing growth. This was kind of the old story. The Kuznets, maybe implied in the Kuznets story, definitely a story that we were taught as God's truth in class, that there is you can reduce inequality, but you sacrifice growth. She finds that. We were provoked to look at the data, her data, more carefully, a little bit with more flexibly, letting the data, just plotting the data rather than running a linear regression. When you do that, you find that, in fact, both increases in inequality and reductions in inequality predict reductions in growth, suggesting mostly that the changes in inequality are probably noise, and that you can get what you want from it depending on what regression you run. So thankfully, I think once we showed that literature had, let's say, slowed down and mostly went away. And I think at this point, I would say you can keep doing these regressions, but what they tell you is, A, you have no way of interpreting them. Well, you don't know what's causal. B, conditional, insisting on interpreting them, you can find whatever you want. So I would say not much evidence that we should worry about, reducing growth. I'll come back to that point actually quite substantially in a bit. The second point that comes up, and this is, of course, it's a great moment to, or tragic moment to mention it, since the Elon Musk has declared that everything the USAID did was corruption, and therefore it deserved to be put in a wood chipper. So corruption is almost the bottom line excuse people give for either being ungenerous to poor countries, and within poor countries to be ungenerous to the poor. In India, you get this quote that from Rajiv Gandhi, that out of 1 rupee given to the poor, 15 or 20 paisa go to the poor. And sometimes people will say, now instead of 15, 25 is going. There's absolutely no evidence for that, by the way. He made it up. He made it up conveniently for people who want to fight social protection. It's been much quoted, never really substantiated. It's worth stopping for a minute and thinking about the theory of corruption. This is some work. I tried to do this work 30 years ago. I have a paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, 1997, a theory paper laying out this argument. I've repeated many times. Somehow it's not been one of my great successes, I would say. The paper is much cited, but never read. So corruption arises from fighting the market. That's why we have government doing things. Government do things. I mean, there are governments in India at some point did many completely idiotic things, like running high-end hotels. There's no reason for a government to run a high-end hotel. It's hard to make a case for it. But for the most part, what governments do is to fight the market. And one can always stop fighting. The US is your prime example of a country where you can buy Trump. You don't fight at all. You make a market in everything, and including the president, as Elon Musk said. He bought him the presidency. So you can go and stop fighting. But if you don't stop fighting, then I think the logic of the argument I was making then was that the bigger the fight, the bigger the scope for corruption. So if you have a specialty hospital which is needs to provide specialty surgery to people who have some very serious disease, it's the fewer beds you have in it per capita, the more the premium people are willing to pay to get at them. And so you get, and therefore, the bigger the fight against the market. What do I mean by fight against the market? There will be many more people who will say, look, why don't you're giving it to that very poor person who's paying you nothing. Why don't you pay, I'll pay you a bit more and I want that bed too. And therefore you get corruption. The scarcer the beds in a hospital, the more corruption you get. There's no black magic there. Nor is there, and likewise, if the targeted group is very poor, you get, then the poorer the targeted group, the more close to free you have to make it. And the more close you have to make it, the more those who are willing to pay can pay extra. And so again, that generates, so the bigger the fight, the bigger the scope for corruption. So it's really very much a matter of reason why it's hard to do redistribution, especially of scarcer goods in poor countries, is partly because the scarcity is fighting the market even more, and so you get corruption. The corruption is not per se evidence that the intervention is failing. It is, and I'll come back to this point as we go, but it's evidence that you're fighting the market. The corruption per se is evidence that the market is pushing back, and the market will push back. The question is, what do you do? You can give up, or and here I would say that there is now a lot of work, some of Jayapal's work, but a lot of work by people not in Jayapal on this issue of corruption. So I give you some few examples from Jayapal's work, but I certainly don't think we are the only people who are doing this work. In Indonesia, this is a project I was involved in. Beneficiaries were getting 1/3 of the rice subsidy they were meant to get. They were paying higher prices and getting lower amounts. And they didn't seem to know, even though the program had been around for 13 years, at the point where we were looking at it, they didn't seem to know what was owed to them. The village government intermediated it and told them whatever was convenient for them. And so when you send them a card with their name printed on it, saying you are a beneficiary, and more pointedly, somebody else is not a beneficiary because it was a targeted program, that by itself, just the name, gets you 26 percentage points of the subsidy back. And if you do the whole package, we randomized each piece of it. The cards, the price that you're supposed to pay for the rice printed on the card, and a public announcement of who are the beneficiaries, then you get basically 58% of the leakage gets clawed back. So part of it is just, we take as given that people know things, and they don't. And if you actually took the trouble to give out the information, that helps. Now, interestingly, during the experiment, in fact, these are all experimental effects. The effects, even though the village government blocked the delivery of the cards, only something like 30 to 40% of the cards got delivered. The rest of the cards they suppressed it because the cards were power for the people, so they suppressed it. It was, so you already had this effect. When we showed the results to the Indonesian government, they sent a card to every beneficiary. And that was done on a special scheme, so it was impossible to block it. It was not done through the standard mail system where you could block it. So most people got cards. A second, so information is one thing, choice is important. So I think this is a paper that has been interpreted many ways. I would say my sense of, so this is a very nice paper by Muralidharan, Niehaus, and Suktankar, showing that if you, instead of making Narega payments through the village government at that point, it's now, I'll say in a bit, it's very different now, but in that time. If you give the smart cards where they could collect the money from multiple people who had each a point of sale terminal where they could verify the smart card and said that yes, you have done this much work, it's in the list, then that reduced leakages by almost half. Indeed, as they show, that had a massive effect, not just on the beneficiaries, but on non-beneficiaries, because it basically raised wages everywhere. In Indonesia, we did an experiment where we, again, going back to this rice program, Raskin, instead of having the rice being delivered to the village and then it being portioned out by the village government, we gave everybody a card which gave them some money to buy either rice or eggs. So you look at the effects of that, total rice consumption doesn't really change. Eggs consumption goes up a little bit. Most importantly, the people who are supposed to get the rice, because there is now competition. You can go to one store or another store. And that reduces poverty by 20%. Just that act. So, last point I want to make on corruption, and then move to my last topic, is the fraction of reported NREGS spending that shows up in survey data in India goes up. So if you provide, as you improve monitoring, things do improve. This is, just to put this against the Rajiv Gandhi 15%, you can find that it goes from 51%, so a lot of money getting stolen in 2007-8, to 80% in 2011-12, and by our calculation, even more, closer to 90% now. So the money is showing up in people's reports of, these are household surveys, they're showing up in household surveys, households are getting the money. This was just over time. So but then we did an experiment where we made the fund flow to Narega automatic, meaning instead of, you get a certain amount of money in your account, then afterwards you account for it. It put the accounting first and the money sending later. What that does is leakages drop by 24%, almost all of it coming out of people who were who didn't exist, who had not work that had not been done. So 24 leakages dropped. Employment goes up slightly. Spending goes down by 24%. We measured the wealth of the program officials, that drops by 10%. And this was then adopted as a national policy, and that leads to a 19% reduction in program expenditure. So it's not that I'm not at all of the view that technology is magic. But it was, here I think it was less the technology that was working than the fact that if you have to upload your roles of who has worked to get the money, the checking can be within a week or a month rather than a year later. A year later is very hard to check. And so this facilitated monitoring. Okay. I have 10 more minutes. Okay, that's perfect. How about incentives? The last argument against being generous to people was the famous, the lazy welfare state recipients. This is an old argument. Bentham, well-known economist, was very much involved in the design of poorhouses, and he was very insistent that poorhouses should be extremely uncomfortable so that poor people don't become too lazy. And this is how they were supposed to sleep. He was insistent, and there were many experts who said, no, the bed should not even be, they should be so narrow that the person is really uncomfortable, because then they'll clearly find a job. And certainly, spouses were not allowed to cohabit, and so on. So there was a whole lot of theorizing of how to do welfare right. There's now a lot of evidence on different cash transfer programs. This is 72 RCTs from 114 studies, 558 different estimates. This is by Crosta et al., Crosta, Dean Carland, Chris Udry, and I think one other person. Different, some are lump sum, some are not. The amounts were substantial. The lump sum were $500 one time, and the monthly transfer was $35, all quite substantial for the very poor, at least. And the estimates vary on between 6 months and 48 months, 34 countries in it. So what's the evidence? People work harder, not a lot harder, but a tiny bit harder. If you give them money, the idea that they become lazy is resoundingly rejected by the data. Does it go up? Yes, it goes up significantly. By a lot, no. Like less than 1%. But positive rather than negative. So people are not getting lazy. Hours also go up a little. Monthly income goes up a little. If you keep going, you can look at the effect of phase out of subsidies. It's the evidence on the phase out of subsidies, which provides so phase out of subsidies meaning at some point you'll stop getting subsidies if you get richer, so that has a disincentive effect. How big is it? There's actually experiments on that, maybe an elasticity of 0.1, which means there is a little bit of phase out, but not a huge amount, certainly not enough to justify not transferring by a huge margin. And this is among the richest of the poor. And in some cases, in fact, you have the opposite. That's what I mentioned, the Karthik's work from before, the fact that people were doing more, were getting more payment from the program actually made people pushed up wages in the private sector as well. So you could imagine it having positive. Okay, last 5 minutes, how to make the best of limited resources. Most countries, again, 3 design topics I want to talk about. One is targeting. Targeting is hard. That's, I think, you can collect all the data you want. People's consumption just moves a lot for very good reasons. They have a celebration of some kind. So when you measure, it's very hard to get very much out of consumption data. It explains maybe half to 2/3 of the variation in consumption, which means a vast amount of inclusion and exclusion error. And that's repeatedly what we find. And then you can tighten that by putting some cost. An extreme version of that is India's workfare program. But you could put even a much smaller cost. Just you have to apply, and then I will check if it's costly to apply and you know you won't get it, you won't apply. If you just do that, you do get better self-selection, but still 40% of the poorest who surely get the programs don't apply. So any cost you put in, you discourage people. So there is there's a little bit of a Hobson's choice there. Now, what do you do? There are various views. My colleagues Ben Olken and Rima Hanna say, target the very poorest. They're the ones who need the most. In that case, you'll make errors. You'll include some people by mistake, but they'll still be very poor because you're just targeting the very poorest. So even if they are not the very poorest, they'll be a little bit above. That's okay, still okay. So one way to go would be that. It depends on how much you care about horizontal equity, because their program leaves out 50% of the people who they think should get it by the design of the program. So you can, if you care about horizontal equity, that seems deeply unfair. The people who are getting it, it's very valuable for them. People who are not getting it, that seems regrettable. Second issue is structuring payments. There is evidence, I would say, that people want some amount of lumpiness in their savings. If you give them transfers, they want lumpiness, partly because they can't really save. So there's a study which asks people if they want lump sums or monthly payments, and 67% want at least half the money to start, but also some deferred payments in case that money runs out. So some combination. And when we did an experiment where we gave people, more relevant for this is, there were either 2 years of monthly payments or one lump sum. The one lump sum had a much bigger effects on earnings, on all kinds of family outcomes, consumption, etc. So there's some argument for structuring the payments. And then there's also evidence that you want to target people's consumption. So if people, or investment. You should target when people have to pay school fees, they want money. So if the money is time for school fees or time for fertilizer buying, that has much bigger effects. So again, designing programs so that it's not every month, but the right months helps. Cash versus kind, more interesting and complicated. On one side, not much evidence at all that giving food, for example, has any effect on nutrition. There's lots of studies, mostly by IFPRI, showing that. Parts where it's very remote, yes, but not otherwise. Cash is much easier to deliver. On the other hand, there is a strong preference for cash, for kind, especially from women who say that this is because it's too liquid and people will, the family members, presumably their husbands, will spend it if it's in cash. Again, almost no evidence on that. There are lots of experiments with target women. Very few find any effects. There are exceptions. I would say the evidence is not dispositive, and you could make the case that giving it to women is necessary, given that they have less labor market opportunities in most developing countries, though increasingly not in most developed countries, is probably a good thing by itself, but is not much evidence on the specific. More open questions. I end on this. AI, I think the first round of attempt of using AI to target better has mostly failed. I think we find very little evidence for it. But there is evidence, for example, that you can combine cell phone data, geographical location data, and survey data to do better. So I think there is interesting possibilities. Biometrics is increasingly used, but it has absolutely clearly problems, especially fingerprints, for example, are a problem for people who work with the hands. So there is a real issue in using biometrics. We have to do it better. Conditionality, that's a whole other set of issues. Some evidence that you get something for it. People send their children to school. Some evidence that it excludes some people. And then question of persistence, how do we design programs so that they last? So I will stop here. It's been 30 years I've been working on it, so I can go on a lot, but I feel that I've thrown a lot at you. We can continue in conversation after. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhijit. It's now my pleasure to welcome our discussant, Dr. Martha Chen, who is the chair of the UNU-WIDER Advisory Board and a distinguished expert on the informal economy. Dr. Chen is a lecturer at the Harvard Kennedy School, an affiliate professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and the co-founder of WIGO, a global research policy action network dedicated to improving the conditions for informal workers. She was awarded the Padma Shri, one of India's highest civilian honors, in recognition of her outstanding contributions. Welcome, Dr. Chen, to the podium to provide her comments. Thank you.
Good afternoon by now. I'm not quite sure. And I just want to thank Kunal Sen and UNU-WIDER, not just for inviting me to be a discussant to Abhijit's lecture today, but for putting the topic of social protection for all on the agenda so squarely at this conference. I also want to thank Abhijit for his pioneering work and his commitment to finding what works for the poor to reduce poverty and inequality. I also want to thank some WIGO colleagues, particularly Laura Alfers and Florian Jurgens-Grant, who helped me get more informed and more nuanced about my remarks. And I want to especially thank the organizations of informal workers in the WIGO network who struggle on a daily basis to secure social protection and decent work for their members. Okay. And I will begin by a few reflections on the early parts of Abhijit's lecture, and then on the design side, go to a more comprehensive systems-wide reform set of reflections. So I was intrigued by the charts that Abhijit began with, and I was pleased to see that there is an increase in the transfers to the bottom 50% over the course of development. But we also know from his chart that this has been uneven, and I was intrigued which countries were sort of above the average line for GDP per capita and which ones were below. The fact that there's less social insurance in low-income countries did not come as a surprise, because that's where you also have a very high prevalence of informal employment, and social insurance tends to be targeted to formal workers. But I was rather dismayed to realize, of course, that the poorest countries have the lowest social assistance rate as well. And I was intrigued by Abhijit's slide on the unhappy correlation that reflects. In terms of the amounts and sources of tax revenue, I was particularly struck by the fact that the indirect taxes are a higher share of total revenue than corporate taxes in all countries, and a higher share than personal income taxes in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe. And this is because, for the most part, value-added taxes in particular tend to be regressive, because lower income households spend a greater share of their income on consumption than higher income countries. This is a fact I think all of us are familiar with. Another fact is that the informal self-employed cannot claim business refunds on value-added tax on the costs of their inputs, because they are not registered enterprises. So that this puts them at a further disadvantage. On the growth and investment, which sequence, I was pleased to hear that Abhijit said the most robust fact, I'm not happy about this, but it's better than you just grow first and redistribute later, is that high inequality countries actually grow slower. And I wanted to add another point from my experience over way too long, that the pattern of growth matters, because the maldistribution during growth, especially if it's not job-led growth, can be greater than most redistribution after growth. And I really do think we have to focus more on distribution during growth. On corruption, I just wanted to flag to Abhijit that both he and I missed in the opening session, and I've heard wonderful tributes to what Aruna Roy said, she gave a powerful presentation on the formation of the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangatan, a large grassroots movement of workers and peasants in India, and its leading role in the Right to Work campaign, which led to the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, and gave birth to the Right to Information campaign, which combated corruption and the arbitrary use of power by claiming the right to know. And that was in Abhijit's slides, the importance of knowledge and of monitoring. And as Aruna Roy reported, both campaigns were built on the mandate of public audit through social audit, where people can monitor the details of income and expenditure in their village councils, but all levels of government expenditure. So let me turn now on the design of social protection by and for informal workers. And I say by because the experience that I'm going to share, the evidence, quote unquote, I know I don't have hard data like economists want, is largely the result of negotiations and advocacy and struggles by organizations of informal workers. So I'll briefly touch on the who, why, and what of informal workers and social protection, share some innovations, and then focus in on one example of participatory planning and governance of comprehensive social protection for informal workers, the case of Thailand. I just wanted to start, as we always have to start with informal economy, that there is an official international statistical definition of informal employment. Economists, I'm sorry to say, you always say there's no definition. There is, and going on 150 countries use this definition in their collection and tabulation of labor force data. It was adopted by the International Conference of Labor Statisticians in 2003. It includes wage workers and subcontracted workers for formal enterprises, informal enterprises, or households who do not get social protection through work. So it's a protection-based definition, not a regulation-based definition. And it includes the self-employed in informal enterprises who have to contribute to their own social insurance. The ILO estimates that around 60% of all workers globally are informally employed. This is as high as 90% in low-income countries and is 80% in low-middle income countries. So the income level of a country shifts faster than the actual labor force structure. A total of 2 billion workers. And these include self-employed, they include wage workers, and a category that has been recently introduced by the same International Conference of Labor Statisticians called dependent contractors, who range from the historic traditional industrial outworkers to the platform workers of today. The ILO data also show links with poverty. Most informal workers are from poor households. And data that WIGO has worked on over the years is that among informal workers, only employers earn on average above minimum wage levels. And employers represent only 3% of all informal workers. So, what about social protection and informal workers? By definition, they don't have it. And that's because they tend to fall through the gap between the tax-based social assistance, which is often targeted at poorest households or the non-working poor, and the contributory social insurance, which is targeted at formal wage workers. What informal workers, the working poor in the informal economy, need and want are comprehensive social protection systems, which include social insurance against all life cycle risks, including tax-based subsidies to their own contributions. tax-based assistance, this might be a child grant or a food subsidy, and affordable, accessible public services, health, education, childcare, and I add basic infrastructure services at their homes and workplaces, because they often work in very informal settlements and informal workplaces. They also, of course, need the right to decent work, which combines employment guarantee schemes for the underemployed, the productivity-enhancing support for the self-employed, and fair wages for wage workers and dependent contractors. There have been innovations negotiated by and for informal workers, targeting the use of labor force data on informal employment in general, excluding the employers, and or specific groups of informal workers, are good proxy indicators of poverty and vulnerability. And the data is increasingly available in upwards of 150 countries, I think now. Financing innovations. There are ways to have employers contribute to informal workers, either in their industry or their value chain. In India, we have industry-based welfare funds and boards for informal workers, long-standing construction workers, BD workers, and others. And now we also have welfare boards and funds for gig workers in Karnataka and Rajasthan states. Thanks again to, in Rajasthan at least, to Aruna Roy and Nitin Day, who's here, who've been part of that struggle. You have also a way that you can formally collectivize mutual contributions by informal workers. The Self-Employed Women's Association of India, which is a trade union of 10 million women informal workers, has an insurance co-op that insures women members against many of the life cycle risks. And you have government subsidies to top up social insurance contributions by informal workers, and I'll share the case of Thailand. And there's been innovations on the risks covered. Unemployment is not a very operative concept for the informal workforce because they keep working no matter what. So the lack or loss of income, the lack of a work order, you can cover that. There are particular occupational health and safety risks of specific groups of informal workers. Just an anecdote, in South Thailand, I was taken to see a OHS scheme, and one of the targeted groups was the palm tree workers who's skinning up the palm trees, carrying a very sharp blade, and you can imagine the occupational health risks involved. Maternity and childcare and old age pension. So let's move to the example of Thailand. The first part of their comprehensive social protection for informal workers is universal health coverage. It started with a 30-baht co-payment scheme in 2002, and the government shifted it to a free tax-funded public health services in 2007. Now, the origins of this are interesting because the monarchy in Thailand has supported public health for many years. There was a Prince Mahidol who studied medicine at Harvard Medical School and helped to modernize health in Thailand. There have also been senior Thai doctors who recommended that all doctors should serve in district hospitals. And you have successive cadres of dedicated doctors and also the public health professionals who have spent upwards of 4 years in district hospitals. And then there was a 1997 law in Thailand that any proposed legislation with 50,000 or more signatures must be debated in Parliament as a people's sector law. And this universal health coverage really came about as a result of a people's sector law that was signed. And it also has involved participatory governance. So you have public health professionals a network of civil society organizations, including HomeNet Thailand, and the political parties who serve on the boards and the subcommittees of the implementation, not just the monitoring of the scheme. Somewhat later, HomeNet Thailand and the Federation of Informal Workers in Thailand successfully got an article introduced into the Social Security Fund designed for self-employed and other informal workers. It has 3 levels of contributions and benefits depending on what the worker feels they can afford. But I should note that the benefits are lower than for formal workers and do not include a guaranteed monthly pension. In a study that WeGo did with local researchers, we found that the primary motivation was compensation for lack of income when sick or injured. And there was an additional motivation during COVID-19 because, again, HomeNet Thailand and the Federation negotiated a relief grant, a one-time relief grant of 5,000 baht, and a 60% reduction in the monthly contributions for 1 year. And Thailand, again, HomeNet Thailand has successfully negotiated for a Home Workers Protection Act based on the ILO Convention 177. Home workers are industrial outworkers who work in their own homes, and there are lots of them. And an occupational health and safety project for home-based workers. And with the network of domestic workers in Thailand, which they helped to form, HomeNet Thailand has successfully negotiated for a ministerial regulation to protect the rights of domestic workers. And they're actively negotiating that domestic workers should be included under the Article 33 for formal workers in the Social Security Fund because they would get more benefits. And they're involved in ongoing negotiations. They want maternity benefits for insured persons under Article 40 of the Social Solidarity Fund, the Social Security Fund, rather, Occupational Development Fund for informal workers, and the participation of informal workers should be statutory in rule setting and policy making process, including the tripartite social dialogue of the ILO. So what is the way forward from this experience and from what we know? First, we need changed mindsets towards the informal economy. Informal workers and their enterprises must be recognized as the broad base of the economy, not just a drag on the economy. Social protection for informal workers should be seen to help reduce poverty and inequality and contribute to increased productivity and economic growth. Third, many informal workers pay taxes. We've done studies in different settings, but receive few benefits. And most are willing to pay taxes in return for benefits, including social protection. And a final point is that informal workers face regulatory and demand constraints, not just supply-side constraints, which undermine their productivity. And economic policy should focus on reducing these constraints. Think of a street vendor. She will not improve her display equipment or buy a fancy scale or increase her stock because every day she has to close up her operation, find a place to store her equipment and stock, and faces harassment on a daily basis and eviction periodically. Those are major constraints to productivity. And the second key pillar of the way forward is to include the informal worker organizations and leaders in the design, implementation, and governance of social protection. Most innovations in social protection around the world that we have seen for informal workers have resulted from negotiations and advocacy by the worker organizations. There are 4 global networks of organizations of informal workers: domestic workers, home-based workers, street vendors, and waste pickers. They have more than 275 affiliated organizations in 90 countries with a total membership of 10 million informal workers. They're actively, on a daily basis, negotiating for social protection and decent work for their members, and they're waiting to be invited to the policy-making table. Thank you.
Started on the Q&A. What I want to say first is that I think Abhijit made a very good argument for using relatively low-cost interventions to address issues of implementation of social protection programs, and that there are ways that can be done using information and so on, and other ways of addressing corruption, for example, and leakages that can be replicated elsewhere in the Global South, apart from the examples that Abhijit brought from Indonesia and in India. And Marty Chen reminded us that social protection for informal workers should not be something that we should forget. So the informal workers in particular, given that we have a large number of them in the Global South, should not fall through the cracks. And there are examples, as from Thailand, where we have seen pretty effective social protection programs for informal workers. So what I want to do is now ask you to have you ask questions. We can have one question at a time because Abhijit would prefer a single question, but we have enough time for all the questions you might ask. You can also ask questions to Marty Chen too. So let's get started. Let's start maybe from that side of the room. And who wants to go first? Oh, Justin, right in front. Can you introduce yourself very briefly and also give your comments?
Well, Justin Lin, a professor at the Peking University, and congratulations for the talk by Abhijit on a very important topics relevant to all of us. Certainly, the comments by Marty was also excellent. My question is very simple. How important family as a social institution to provide social protection for all the members in the society, and especially in the low-income country? Because I did not hear both of you to mention families as an institution providing social protection.
Thanks. Abhijit?
So I think you're right that the family has traditionally been, in fact, often the key institution in it. I think part of the reason why we are talking about other institutions is demographic change, massive demographic change, even across, less in Africa, but anywhere in Asia, fertility rates are collapsing. Even in, for example, in southern India, they're way below replacement now. And Bangladesh, they're just crossed replacement. So fertility has fallen massively. That has the consequence that many people, especially women, we have now data from Tamil Nadu, and one thing we see is that for women over 65, the fractional living alone is stunningly high because they often had one son, and the one son works somewhere else, or they don't get along with their daughter-in-law, or the son died. All of those, if you're 80-year-old. So in fact, there is remarkably high levels of loneliness comparable to the US among the elderly in Tamil Nadu, something we didn't know till we did the survey. So one of the reasons is that I think we're in a moment where the demographics are changing fast. And so we can't, family no longer is what it used to be. It wasn't, you have a combination of mobility. People are moving to the city, you know this in China, leaving the parents often in the village, and also very low fertility. And I think that the combination of two means that it's often, there's no caregiver left. I think that's a reason to take it seriously in this moment, that it has to be the state, the community, something else has to step in, because it's not going to be those who have the family, it's nice. Those who don't will need to be something done about it. And I think this is a very good moment to think about it, especially I would say in Asia.
Mr. Abhijit, Marty, family as a mechanism for insurance and assistance.
Just two additional comments. In the early 90s, I did a study in India of all ever widowed women in 14 villages. And half of the widows lived in an all-female house. I mean, there may have been young boys and children, but which goes against the norm of what the joint family is supposed to provide for some of the reasons. So I think relying on the traditional family norms can be a risky proposition for many. And there's also the mutuals that communities create. But as one WIGO colleague put it, it's like asking the anemic to give a blood transfusion. Because if you're talking about really poor communities, there's only so much they can do through the mutuals. So I think a social protection scheme funded by contributions from government and employers and taxes, public taxes, are very, very central.
I say one more thing, which is it's an excellent question. I also, it's always been the case that, I mean, my colleague Rob Townsend has been studying this for years, that social protection from the family and from the extended family and even the community does much better against idiosyncratic shocks than against any kind of collective shocks. Just there is not much there then. That's exactly Marty's point. And I think that with climate change, we're going to see more and more of these geographically concentrated shocks, which are exactly the shocks that neither the family nor the community is able to deal with very well.
Thanks. I saw a question, a hand, there's Nikhil, I think. If you could introduce yourself, Nikhil. No, you need to wait for the mic. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much. I want to refer to an issue that...
If you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Nikhil. I work with the MKSS. Aruna spoke in the opening plenary. I work in the same organization in Rajasthan and have worked for 30, 40 years as well on these issues, but on the ground. I want to refer to an issue that was talked about in a very positive way, even in the first opening plenary panel, but I think has a lot of dangers in many of the issues that we are talking about. I'm not speaking against it, I'm talking of digitization and the entire delivery through digitization, and now it's become something that's assumed to be good. Now, even in your thing, you talked about banks and payment through banks and what you talked about, what you looked at. Just to give a little, in Rajasthan, we found as soon as you put a different payment agency from the implementation agency, even before you could make bank payments, that reduced corruption enormously, because someone else was going to be held responsible just for that payment being made. And banks and post offices did that in NREGA very well. Today, digitization, along with Aadhaar, which is talked about all across the world as a great thing, is leaving out large numbers of people. And I don't have the time to go into it, but how do we measure if people who are alive and pensioners are marked dead? Not just because of biometric verification, because of biometric mixed with Aadhaar, mixed with the bank, mixed with KYC, know your customer procedures, mixed with demographic data and names, one letter being wrong, because this digital system is a complete centralized dictatorship. You are just somewhere in some remote place, you have worked and you're not shown as having worked. You live and you're shown as dead. You are shown as something or the other, and there is no way to correct that until you are actually dead. So this is something, is that not worse than corruption? Exclusions, and the exclusions, the first time we ran across it in Rajasthan, there were 250,000 people marked dead without proof of them actually being dead. There were 200,000 marked as duplicate, and their pensions had been stopped. And we found 90% of them in our village when we got them their names, and in our block, 80% were actually alive. So this is the kind of thing that I just want to say, that we need to, and especially in groups who think that interventions through things like this are cheaper, more efficient, we need to look at the exclusions because it's the most marginalized. And last thing I want to add to that is the front face of digitization are private. You talked about the market. I don't know whether I misunderstood you. It's handed over to the market. That delivery that was being done through government servants earlier is now being done through market-based common service centers, millions of them all over, or banking correspondents, millions of them all over. And there is no cost for corruption, and there's huge corruption in that which is not being recorded. So even for corruption, as we switch to the private sector for delivery, there's a lot that we need to think about.
Thank you. Abhijit? Yeah.
I guess on the, I tried to flag the biometrics point. I think your point is, I've had more, I actually totally agree with you on your first point, which is that I think the biometrics particularly don't work for the very poor, but as you're right, there is also the deduplication process, which is itself broken. I went fast. I would have. I don't disagree at all. I think this is. I don't think of that being an argument for not trying to use the technology. It's an argument for trying to build better safeguards. I think there is a round of safeguards, but the safeguards are so much based on suspicion rather than, I think the presumption of the safeguards is that you're lying rather than the presumption is that the system is broken. And I think that's a problem. I think there is, I think, a fair amount of scope for working on the safeguards, working with state governments to actually implement their own versions of it when somebody is excluded, including, as you say, through community verification. This, I think, more generally, I would say this has also been the problem of using AI, which I mentioned. It's exactly the same problem in a sense. The data is selective, and therefore the AI uses the data that's there, and the data, it doesn't understand the ways in which the data is selective, and that's not very closely related to this question of, what if you are claimed to be dead? There's no, AI can't do anything about it at that point. On the second one, I think we really need to think about how to use, you said exactly right, that that some separation between the people who, who control the activity and people who make the payment is a good thing. I think multiple layers of separation is even better. I don't think there is I think having option of going to the post office or the bank would be better, because that way, one thing, the hold-up problem is massive. The local postman says, you pay me, I know enough examples of this, of you pay me X amount to get the money. So if you say, I can also go to the bank, then you can. So I don't think that that's an argument against competition. It's an argument against making people aware that they have many options. A lot of the cases, we found that people don't know that they have options, that they could go to a bank instead of to the post office. And they could, so I think that here I do feel that there is benefits from competition. We just have to be mindful that the competition is set up in the right way.
Okay, more questions? Put your hand up so I can see you. There's one question there. I think I see your hand there. Right there. Let me just wait up for the mic. And again, introduce yourself, please.
I'm Edson Severnini from Boston College and a non-resident senior research fellow here at UNU-WIDER. Thanks for the presentations. My question is related to climate change. I would like to hear more your thoughts about how climatic changes will challenge the social protection systems or social assistance worldwide, particularly in low and medium income countries. There's some evidence that there will be more need for healthcare, for example, and there will be more need for infrastructure rebuild. But also, there's some evidence that we saw here in this conference that maybe tax revenue might reduce. And so how the funding issues will emerge and challenge the systems that are in place right now, or even challenge the future systems?
Thanks. Abhijit.
I could, we're about to finish a book manuscript on this issue, so I could spend a long time on this, maybe too long. So let me say one thing, and then we should have the book out soon. I think one of the things that, other than I think the points you made, that's I think less emphasized, is just what happens to people who can't work because the temperature is 45 degrees. And in a sense, I've been doing a survey on that, informal, not very well organized, but I think it's very, very clear that people say, we'll just keep working, and that there's no choice. Literally that. I think that at some point we need to think of social interventions where certain days people should not be allowed to work even if they want to. Because the damage is long-term, and you don't necessarily feel it, but you die nonetheless. The kidney damage is very serious, and the effect on life expectancy now, I think people are starting to understand the causal paths. So I don't think that there is it's going to be a point where I think banning work on certain days will be the right thing to do, but then what will people do since they are paid their day labor? So I really think that that's one of the things. No employment-based or even self-employment-based scheme right now has any even design features that address that. So, and then there's a broader question of where would you even go when it's 50 degrees and you live in a shed with a tin hut? I was asking some people. I mean, it's 60 degrees inside there. You'll just die of just being inside. So what do you do? So I really think we're nowhere near addressing these issues. I mean, the issues that you mentioned are actually kind of the ones that we have some vocabulary for. But what happens when it's 60 degrees inside your home? We have no vocabulary for it, and we need some way of getting people out of those places, or we're just killing them.
Thank you.
Just one little addition. SEWA has introduced an insurance health against heat, a heat insurance product for its members who can't work during heat, extreme heat.
Okay.
Just to say. But I completely agree, but it's so much more than heat. The land is eroding in Bangladesh, everything. There's so many aspects of the climate change phenomenon.
There's a question right in front there.
This is Nasser from Pakistan. As you know, the Pakistan is running national UCT program at a very large scale. Around 9 million beneficiaries are currently receiving that program. And if I look at the last slide that you mentioned about the design of the program and how we can improve and what would be the way forward. So the BISP is basically a fully digitized system where all payments would go through the biometric verification, and there are a lot of point of sale at every village and in every point where they can get the benefit. And about the registration, we have a well-defined and digitized census. The first census was conducted back in 2010 when the program was initiated, and then the recertification process was done or completed in 2020. And now we have the dynamic registry where there is a regular updation of the data. But the question about the effectiveness of this program, if we look into the recent poverty estimate, it's going up despite providing lot of funds. Around this time, the allocation is more than 700 billion PKR. It's almost equal to the total development expenditure of the Pakistan. So, what went wrong with that type of UCT if we have a well-defined transfer system as well as the registration system which reduce the inclusion and exclusion error? The second question to Martha about the street vending, the informality. In Islamabad, we did a pilot about providing them, these street vendors, some kind of licenses to establish their court and like something like that. But eventually, the district administration didn't allow to expand that network and excluded from the system. You know, the mindset of these bureaucrats that they didn't allow these poor people to be integrated within that system. Then how we can address this bureaucratic structure and the mindset to allow them actually to be part of the entire ecosystem? Because currently they didn't allow them, they excluded them. And if they informally located somewhere in the street and they are paying very high rent, even double than what they are earning, either to the shopkeeper, either to the district administration. So how we can address these issues if we really expand and to include these informal sectors within the formal economy? Thank you.
Thanks, Aziz. So one is about inclusion, exclusion errors, but perhaps Marty, you could go first on the bureaucratic mindset that is there with working on with trying to get the state to change its mind about informal workers, which you know a lot about.
I think the mindset challenge, Ila Bhatt, the founder of SEWA, said the biggest challenge she faced in building SEWA was the mindset of not just the bureaucrats, but also, unfortunately, the economists about the informal economy. So what we need is to understand, and we need evidence on this, and there is some growing evidence, on what share, let's say, of poor households buy goods and services from street vendors, right? We need to know what share of middle-class households buy goods and services from street vendors, because then we can make the case to the local authorities that the street vendors are part of the local economy. We do have evidence that when the cities move in and sweep street vendors off central locations to the periphery of the city, they almost always come back, even if they're given a built market to sell, because where they get their business is from the pedestrian flow. And the struggles to relocate street vendors back into what Sewa calls the natural markets, where they've always congregated, are ongoing. But there is success, and in some cases there is a recognition on the part of local authorities of the role and value of street vendors. However, you can change the mind of one member of the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, let's say, but there's a turnover all the time. So the struggles just keep on. But the organizations have increasing evidence on the contributions of the workers. They have put stay orders, they've filed legal cases, and most importantly, they build the organizations so that the struggles continue. There's no simple solution, but they are part of the economy, and they sell goods and services at cheaper prices in convenient locations for both the working class and the middle class.
Thank you. Abhijit, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I feel like this is part of the reason why we do randomized control trials, is because there's something else that's also happening in the Pakistani economy, as you know well. So what the counterfactual is seems to me entirely unclear. I mean, is it that the program has failed, or is it the case that the Pakistani economy is failing, and as a result, there is more poverty? I mean, think of all of what happened to last summer and the summer before in the floods and to agriculture. So I don't know that I would take it as a premise that that it's a program that failed. I mean, that's a reason to do a randomized control trial.
Okay, more questions? Maybe from this side of the audience. Anyone from here? Put your hand up so that we can see you. No, it's okay. All right, let's go back there. So,
Can we
gentleman right in the
diversify
middle.
by gender?
And again, introduce
Try
yourself.
to get some.
Thank you so much for the very interesting remarks. My name is Jussi Kivipura. I come from UNICEF. There hasn't been much talk about children. So how do you see kind of what is the relevance of social protection for these children in these families who kind of are receiving or are not receiving the social protection? How does it affect to their lives, either in an immediate situation when the social protection is given, as well as what is the relevance in their trajectory of their life on a longer term? Thank you.
I think there's plenty of evidence for the short run, which is that nutrition improves, especially in some ways. It's interesting. The families often face a choice between investment and consumption, and when they invest, they don't realize that investing in the nutrition of the children is an investment, so they often will start their business rather than that. And I don't know that we have a great study which shows that which one is better for the family. So I think that's an issue, but there's also very clear evidence that nutrition in general improves when there's more money around, not surprisingly. In fact, what is striking, and maybe what a lot of economists like Angus Deaton and others told us 30 years ago, is that, the marginal rupee, dollar, peso doesn't tend to go into nutrition. I think what we find interestingly is from social programs, if anything, it's the opposite. So the average propensity to consume food out of income is lower than the marginal propensity, meaning the extra money is more likely to go into food than the base money, which is the opposite of what Angus and others taught us to think about. So I would say the evidence is very positive there. I've written about that. And so in that sense, I think if any, there's a other part of the question, which is, do we know much about the very long term? And the answer is really very little. Very few. So there we know things like, I think there is the very long-term follow-up of this very small study in Jamaica, where you can see that after 20 years, the children who were given early childhood nutrition and other forms of care are earning much more, much more, actually, even 25 years later. So, but there are just too little of that, of long-term follow-up studies.
So we have quite a few PhD fellows who visit WIDER, both who are currently visiting us and those who have visited us in the past. And we also have quite a few students from local universities. So I'm going to now actually target those two groups for questions. And so perhaps PhD fellows who have been visiting us now or have visited in the past, use the opportunity to ask questions to Abhijit and Marty. Who wants to do it first? Okay, there's one. Yes, okay. And we just want to see who else is there so we can just make sure. Anyone else?
Thank you. I'm Jonathan Garcia. I'm a PhD student at Humboldt and a PhD fellow at WIDER now. I want to ask you a little bit more about targeting. I think there's a strong evidence of PNT doing better for poverty targeting, for example, but I mean, within the frame of social protection, and adaptive social protection also for CHOGS. How do you see the PNT for the case of CHOGS? And in that line as well, how much can we really gain for the method itself? Like we see, it's not that the computational methods are limited, but it's that probably we cannot really predict very well either CHOGS or better ways of vulnerability.
I didn't understand the question. Did you understand the question? I didn't understand it.
Hard to follow.
I didn't understand the question.
Yeah, could you make it
in particular?
Clear?
Sorry.
On your recommendation, for example, on the AI, how much can we really improve the targeting from the methodological part? Or, I mean, is there really a room to improving that in the method itself computationally? Or is another the problem that we are not able really to predict vulnerability and different level of vulnerability, not only chronic poverty, but transitional type of food insecurity, for example, that is more idiosyncratic rather than chronic?
Okay, good question. So I think the big problem is not the models we are using. I think what we've seen is that the big problem aren't the models we are using. Meaning it's not the case that if you used a random forest rather than a linear model of using the PMT variables, you do much better. The answer is you get small improvements. We did that many years ago, actually, and found nothing much. So truth is, but the issue is having high-frequency data. And cell phone data offers that option because you can get cell phone data at a much higher frequency. You can see which family is not using its cell phone anymore. And that's usually a sign of they're trying to save money. So I think we need to triangulate. Otherwise, we have a snapshot of a family. We usually ask them, how much did you spend on consumption in the last week? And in the last week, maybe it was a celebration, and you spent a lot. And that's going to be now you for 5 years. That's a disaster because there's actually we talk a lot about consumption smoothing, but in fact, the evidence is people counter smooth. They save and then they have a party. They like to have friends over. They like to celebrate. So I think the whole model is based on this, I think, misguided idea that everybody is smoothing all the time. And therefore, we get it wrong systematically. But that has the implication that a one-time, if everybody smoothed as much as they could, then a one-time measure of consumption would be pretty good, because they don't allow any variation. If people do counter-smoothing, then it will be very bad. And unfortunately, we theorized it and ignored the data for very long. I think if you look at the data, people are clearly counter-smoothing a lot. And therefore, it's not that they're not smoothing, they're also counter-smoothing. And therefore, the data is very unreliable. And therefore, if you take one snapshot, if you take a snapshot, you get reliable measurement, but over a short period. If you take backcasting data, ask them how much you spent over a year, people don't seem to remember. So you get biased data. So we really need other sources of data. I think in particular, probably cell phone data is a good source. There's some evidence, some work suggesting that also. So maybe we can make progress.
Yeah, thank you. So again, PhD fellows, let me see. Arun, I'm just going to wait to see a couple of more, those who are visiting us on the PhD program, the PhD fellows or students on the universities.
And I would love questions from
I can't really,
women.
Yeah, I can't, exactly. I'm very
I'll be blunt. I don't understand
so
why.
Maybe the next targeting, we have to have more women asking questions, but I can't see anyone.
Hi.
Okay, good. Yeah,
I'm
thank you.
Shatakshi Gupta. I'm a PhD student at George Washington University. And so I was unsurprised by the data that India to be one of the countries which is spending very least shares of expenditure on social expenditure as the share of GDP. But I would like to know your thoughts about the fact that which do you see as one of the biggest reasons for these countries, low and middle income countries, not being able to spend or at least not prioritize social protection as they're spending? Is it more like a government willingness incentive there, or is it more a financial issue or certain other reasons? And how do you see as the things that we can do going forward to prioritize these things in countries like this?
Some of this, I'm going to say something and let Marty say. Some of this is clearly a choice. And to be honest, I can't tell you that there is very clear data that you should not build roads. So there's a lot of priority in India on road building. Some of that is very clearly social spending, the PMGSY, the Gram Sadak Yojana, which is a last mile program, does find very poor people, often reaches communities that are excluded. Others are more shiny highways, but that's a very clear choice.
What I would add is, if you take the health sector, at least fairly recently, the share of the Indian budget that went into health was lower than what the WHO standard was. That's a choice, right? Yeah. The investment, more recent, for health was not around primary health centers and all like Thailand, but it was an insurance on hospitalization, right? Now, hospitalization is a crippler for poor families and their households, but for people whose body is their only asset and they're doing manual work, the preventive healthcare, the primary healthcare is also important. And so I think India is failing its citizens, and I say that as somebody who For me, Dil Hai Hindustani, I grew up in India. I love it dearly, but I feel that it has failed on getting enough social protection. So what you have is a patchwork of small insurance schemes for fisher folk because their occupation is hazardous. There is a pension for widows, but it can only go so far. And if there were not the public distribution system, the food subsidies, that little pension would go nowhere. So it's a modicum of a patchwork in India, and we really need a systems reform to that includes health services as well as health insurance. It includes pensions for informal workers who have to keep working. They don't retire and suddenly become pensioners. So we really have to do systems reform in India.
And Aruna, let's wait for the mic to arrive.
Thank you. We're talking about social protection, and we are also talking about transparency and corruption. So I just wanted to share something about how digital interventions can actually help people both fight corruption and access social protection. In Rajasthan, when the government of Rajasthan decided to go digital, the campaigns got together and said the first thing you'll have to do is to put the provisions for transparency under the Right to Information Act, Section 4, on the website. So we demanded that all the departments of the government of Rajasthan would put proactively all the information required under Section 4 on the website. And it's been an amazing website because it's given us access to real-time information on rations. You can access today who's lifted rations from my village, and from a particular card, you can make out who in that family went to access that ration. So it's in real time, and we've had it with community participation. The website was formed with community participation, is monitored to some extent by the community. And just to give you an idea of the scale, 180 million visits have been made to that website in the last 4 years. And apart from that, 40 million downloads have also taken place. So the argument is not that we are against digitization, but how will it work for both social protection and for the community and for people who are really marginalized? And I think that requires a great deal of thinking about technology, but also involving people at the grassroots, people who are vulnerable groups. So each particular group, whether it was the mining group, which looks at mining rights, or the details of it have been worked out with special groups. And as Martha said, I re-emphasize that the community must be somewhere involved for social protection. Otherwise, we don't get it. So they must know where exactly the cutting edge is.
Thank you, Aruna. I think this reflects what you said earlier, Abhijit, about information and community.
Though I think that there is something interesting there, which we're just writing a paper about, so I'll mention it. One thing that you also learn, and this is a mixed bag, I would say, is that the community has its own preferences. And we start to see, when we've been doing these experiments where we ask the community to identify the poor and who for social transfers, who needs help, etc. And you see it's a mixture of two things. One is that they have certain specific types of information, and they have a theory of who is deserving. And I actually would like to throw it back to Aruna to reflect on, are there dangers of that, of the community? I mean, going back to Ambedkar, do you worry that the community is... So we're writing a paper about it. I'd love to hear your gut reaction on this question of the community having its preferences and its judgment about who's a member of the community, who's not, So we did a study, I'll tell you one last fact, where we asked the community to identify the poorest, and the people they identified were all very poor. The people they left out were people who lived on the margin of the village. who they didn't count as part of their community. They thought those people, they are Banjaras, they're not us. And that to me is the challenge, and how one deals with the community having strong preferences. I wonder if you have a minute to say something.
I don't know that where to the mic to arrive, so quickly. No, we literally need to have the mic.
They want you have to be on TV.
Yes, exactly.
Actually, the two parts to the statement that I made, the transparency was relating to government programs and government rules, regulations, and access to information that would help us regulate the delivery for social protection. To your question about identification in communities, there is no such thing as a community. That's the first thing you understand when you do work in the villages. So if you go to Dr. Ambedkar's definition, the person who gave us the Indian Constitution, there are the most vulnerable communities and the marginalized communities, and there's a community which assumes importance as the community which is the voice of the people. So I really do think that there has to be discrimination in identification of communities, and in India especially, where we are caste and class divided and gender divided, there has to be. Of course, I agree with you that communities have to be defined, and you always leave out the people at the margins, at the absolute margins, when you just go by community decision. But I was actually talking about a government program of information, which could be accessed by the community, and if they leave out some of the important information on the website, we can go and confront them and say, in the mining department, you've left out that particular information. In the health thing, you've left out that particular information. It's an interaction between the digitalized world and the community.
No, I wasn't. You said at the end that we have to include community in social protection, and on that point, I've been thinking about exactly that point. We're trying to write a paper, and that's where I'm concerned.
Actually, if you do a transparency meeting in a village, with the information that you've received from the community before everybody, then the really marginalized will get included. It has to be a public event where everybody has a voice to say the absolutely marginalized have not been included.
They don't show up. They're not invited.
They're not invited.
They're not invited. This is really very interesting issue to me.
Absolutely, yeah. But I'm afraid that we have to bring the Q&A session to a close and the wider 29th annual lecture to a close. So I'm going to make some closing remarks, but thank you so much for your questions. And I want to actually start off by thanking Abhijit and Marty for the wonderful lecture, Abhijit, and also Marty for your very insightful reflection. So maybe we should first start with giving you both a round of applause. And thanks to all of you here and online for your thoughtful questions and engagement. Really appreciate the variety of questions we have received, and which also Abhijit and Marty answered so nicely. So the wider annual lecture is meant to spark new thinking on the biggest questions in development. And today's lecture did just that. It reminded us that social protection systems are only as effective as the implementation. That better outcomes depend not only on how much we spend, but how well we deliver. And I think that's a key message that came out today from Abhijit's lecture. And this insight is particularly timely because we have just released a new guidebook on strengthening social protection systems in complex humanitarian settings. It's available now on our website, and you can download it for free. It brings together practical lessons and evidence to support those working on the front lines of crisis response. And this message also resonates with our 40th anniversary theme, the power of shared knowledge. As you've seen throughout this conference and in the lecture today, where researchers, policymakers, and practitioners work together, real change becomes possible. And so what I want to do now is to end by warmly inviting you to join us in the lobby for a lunch reception and continuing the conversation with Abhijit and Marty. But before we break, a few final words of thanks. To our conference participants and guests, we are sending you a feedback form later today. So it's going to be in your email inboxes later today. I'll be grateful for your reflections to ensure that we can make next year's conference even better. So we would really appreciate a 100% response rate, if that's ever possible. And then thanks to the amazing UNU-WIDER team for the dedication and teamwork that has made this event possible. So thanks again to them, and we need to give them a round of applause.